In the paper, we are analyzing the association agreement, the three association agreements with Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. And we are analyzing what the countries, the three associated countries, have committed themselves to implement. And I have to say, it's not an easy task because those association agreements are amongst the most complicated, comprehensive, and ambitious agreements in the world. So we do a bit of analysis about the commitment that the three countries have made. And then we actually, given what we identify as the commitment capacity gap, we study to what extent the EU is actually helping those countries to implement the association agreements. Because the countries, the, in a way, paradox of the Eastern Partnership in general, but especially the association agreement in particular, is that they are supposed to address the weaknesses, such as the weak institutions, weak rule of law, and lack of financial resources, which actually hamper, which make the implementation more difficult. So given the very extensive experience of the EU when it comes to implementing and supporting transformation, both in the accession countries and now in the Western Balkans, and we wanted to see and assess how the EU is actually supporting the implementation of the association agreements. And from that point of view, the main findings are somewhat surprising. I have to say that this paper has been co-authored by an international team of scholars and experts, and that was the only way we could do it because the actually scope of analysis exceeds the capacity of any single researcher. But this sort of multi-team effort and sort of allowed us to draw some conclusions across the three countries. And to be honest, we ourselves have been fairly surprised. Because when it comes, for example, to Ukraine, the EU has definitely been adaptive, has been innovative, and adjusting to the difficult situation in Ukraine since 2014. Surprisingly, we don't see the same degree of innovation and even sort of adjustment that in Moldova and Georgia. In Moldova, certainly there has been a degree of realization about the fundamental weakness of the Moldovan state, but it happened, in our view, only belatedly in 2014 following the major bank scandal. Paradoxically, in Georgia, and Georgia is a very interesting case because it's the country which has been most skeptical about such a comprehensive and deep agreement. It always more sort of light touch agreement. Paradoxically, in Georgia, which has taken on the same commitments as Moldova and Ukraine, the actual degree of realization that the capacity and perhaps the modernization priorities of Georgia are not necessarily served by this comprehensive and overwhelming adoption of the acquis, I mean the body, the corpus of rules of the EU, we have not seen the same innovations. Having said that, there is some discussion starting now. So perhaps to our surprise, we have not seen, although we've seen adaptation in Ukraine to some extent, we have not seen amongst the EU institutions a comprehensive lesson learning from operating in sort of difficult countries like the Western Balkan context. We have not seen a systematic sort of lesson learning and sort of adapting the EU policy to the Eastern Partnership, even though it seems to be even more merited than in the Western Balkan context.
What is the relevance of that paper and why is it important?
Because we believe that association agreement is what the countries wanted. It's what the EU offered. It did respond to demand. I mean, it is very much nothing that, as it's often said, that the EU imposed the agreement on Ukraine. Ukraine actually lobbied for several years before even was granted the right to negotiate the agreement. Having said that, the association agreement, which includes, as some experts estimate, between 80 and 90% of the acquis communautaire, which is related to the single market. So basically, meaning that Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, as third countries, have effectively agreed to take on the European textbook of rules, have actually no capacity to implement it. There are big hopes about what is called the EU's transformative power, but just the agreement itself does not provide sort of an instrument to do it. It needs to be implemented in a sort of cost, sort of feasible in terms of actually cost, in terms of sequencing, in terms of addressing the priorities, and assistance, EU assistance and support needs to be geared toward this. But we have only seen it to a limited extent in Ukraine. Having said that, what we've seen in Ukraine is actually very important and it's interesting. We can highlight, for example, 3 innovations. One of them is the creation of the support group to Ukraine, which is an ad hoc special type of body which basically intermediates between Ukraine and the EU institutions. We've seen creation of new assistance programs which move away from the classic template of technical assistance, which has its uses, but we actually argue that it's overused and it's not used very effectively in the context of Ukraine. And the third is, for example, given the fundamental sort of weakness and lack of resources within the Ukrainian state, the fact that the EU has decided to adopt this very innovative program of funding, indirect funding for civil servants who work within the government of Ukraine. This is unprecedented. The EU has actually supported sort of institute capacity building in such a way when the Ukrainian state itself is not able to do it. So those things are innovative, but we argue still other reforms need to be done not only in Ukraine, but especially in Moldova and Georgia.